Hi, this is Alan Shavitz, board member and webmaster for Marin Coalition. Before we get started on this program, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. This is a Zoom meeting with a function called Spotlight. It is best viewed if you put yourself in speaker view, which you can do by going to the top right corner of your screen and selecting speaker view. The meeting is being recorded and the program will be available on our website under program archives. You're not going to be in that recording, so don't worry about your anonymity. There are a few icons at the bottom of your screen, which you can see if you hover your cursor over the screen. One is the chat icon, which you can use to enter a question or comment at any time. Just select on chat and type in your question. The other approach is to use the raise hand icon, which will allow you to verbally ask a question. It basically puts a raised hand on your screen so we can recognize that you wish to speak. At the right time, when there's time available, you'd be asked to unmute yourself and speak. Without further ado, I'd like to turn this program over to our host, Scott Pinsky.
And I think that's me. Thank you, Alan, and welcome everyone to the first event in our 2023-24 season for Marin Coalition. My name is Scott Pinsky, the chair of Marin Coalition, and I have a couple of quick announcements that I'll run through as quick as I can, and then I'll get out of the way and turn the program over to our guest moderator, Noah Griffin. First of all, our next program will be in October 4, Wednesday at noon, and this will mark our return to the McGinnis Golf Center in San Rafael for a live program, one of our luncheon programs. This is going to be entitled the California Insurance Challenge, and the program will cover where things stand for homeowners in California in light of recent announcements by numerous homeowners insurance carriers that they are looking to reduce their participation in the California property coverage market. Our presenters will be Mark Brown, the Executive Officer of the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, Jean Bonander, a retired local official and consultant, and Amy Bach, who is from the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. Very highly qualified and esteemed panel, if I may say so myself. This is going to be our first live in-person luncheon event since the pandemic began. So we're very excited to be coming back in person to our home territory at McGinnis. And to attend, if you are interested, please visit our website, marincoalition.org, where you'll find full information about the program and details as to how to register. One other note, this past year, our board decided to simplify our operation as a nonprofit corporation here in California by eliminating our membership structure. So we no longer have elections and membership lists and dues and all of that kind of bureaucracy. We're a much simpler organization, but at the same time, as a nonprofit group, we still have certain expenses, and we rely on the donations of our audience to keep the organization afloat and in good standing with the state. So we therefore ask you to consider making a donation in any amount that you're comfortable with to help us support our operation if you are able. And again, you can find full information about that on our website, marincoalition.org. Okay, now today's program. Many of you are aware that several months ago, last spring, we did a program featuring 3 local law enforcement leaders to discuss steps being taken by their respective departments to address concerns about how these agencies are dealing with perceived problems in the realm of policing within our communities. Today, we're pleased to present a second panel to discuss the same issues from a different perspective, this time from the community perspective. Our panel for this program will be introduced by our moderator, Noah Griffin. Noah has been a fixture of Bay Area politics, arts, and culture for his entire life. A graduate of Fisk University in Nashville, he earned his JD from Harvard Law School before embarking on his several careers. He served on the staffs of the Mayor of San Francisco, Frank Jordan, Senator Dianne Feinstein, and Charles Schwab. He's hosted radio shows with KGO, KFRC, and K101. He's written op-ed pieces for, among others, the San Francisco Examiner. He serves on the editorial board of the Examiner. He's written for the Boston Globe, and he appears frequently in the Marin Independent Journal, where he served on the editorial board. He currently, he recently has served as a member of the Tiburon Town Council until his recent retirement. It's my privilege and honor to introduce your moderator for today's event, Noah Griffin. Welcome, Noah.
Thanks for the very generous introduction, Scott. As we all know, today is the 22nd anniversary of 9/11, and I was asked by Charlotte Schultz, Swig, etc., to write a song commemorating that 22 years ago, which I did, which I'd like to share with you, honoring that occasion. In the line of duty, a fallen hero gives a life to protect and defend us. In the line of duty, giving a husband or a wife, or the children God sends us, leaving to go to work each day, knowing they may not return. Lord knows it's not just for the pay or the respect that they earn, but doing a job that needs to be done so some mother's offspring, daughter or son, sees beauty, not the things that you see. In the line of duty, a father husband gives a life to protect and defend us. In the line of duty, leaving a husband or a wife, or the children God sends us, leaving to go to work each day, knowing they may not return. Lord knows it's not just for the pay or the respect they may earn, but doing a job that needs to be done for some mother's offspring, daughter or son, sees beauty, not the things that you'll see in the line of duty. A moment of silence for the firemen and women and folks who died at 9/11. Thank you. Policing in communities of color has undergone increased scrutiny, ushered in by the video recorded death of George Floyd, May 25th, 2020, at the knee of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. The guilty verdict handed down in this case was a far cry from the 1991 exoneration of the Los Angeles police, whose brutal beating of Rodney King was also captured on video. Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor are but a few names of the myriad of unarmed Black people killed by police under suspicious circumstances. Although the argument is often made that there are only a few bad apples in police departments across the country, taking into account the 18,000 police jurisdictions, were there only 2 departments that would add up to 36,000 bad apples. Although the policing situation in Marin is nowhere near what we have seen in nearby Bay Area Antioch community, where racist, homophobic, anti-Semitic texts have jeopardized the stability of the entire force, there are still questions as to whether Marin measures up to, say, San Francisco, where a strong police commission oversees an understaffed force whose numbers are down by 600 sworn officers. The low numbers of people of color in the county is felt to be a determinant of a non-constituency driven call for change. Despite low numbers of Blacks in the town of Tiburon, 35, the controversial after-hours confrontation between a downtown Main Street Black store owner and police prompted a 3-hour town hall Zoom meeting, followed up by a lawsuit which the town wound up settling. Part of the settlement included a formation of a citizens advisory panel, the independence of which has been called into question. Another result of the Yema incident, as it was called, was the establishment of a diversity inclusion task force, which of late has met but 4 times in the past 8 months. Similar issues have arisen in Mill Valley, where statistically driven reports on policing have gone unacted upon. Despite what may seem to many as setbacks, there have been some glimmers of hope. The Bay Area News Group sued and won the right to have released the investigative report on the beating by San Rafael police of a man in the Canal District drinking a beer. The prior program, which prompted this one, featured police chiefs from various communities around Marin, talking to the issues that they felt important in policing in their towns. This prompted many of the community to feel that only one side of the issue had been covered. We asked the people within the community, who are the ones being policed, have an opportunity themselves to address what they feel to be significant issues. As a result, we have put together a team of community representatives who themselves would like to speak to this issue and open it up to those who signed up by Zoom also to voice their concerns. Our panelists this evening include Paul Austin, founder and CEO of nonprofit Play Marin, a group he formed to address the lack of recreational activities that challenge the Marin City community and intentionally give kids of diverse ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds the opportunity to play, learn, and grow together. Mr. Austin is committed to tackling racial and economic disparities within Marin County and beyond, and his work also touches the lives of hundreds of local youth. Formerly Director of Recreation for Marin City Community Services District, he also served as College Completion and Career Advisor for Bridge the Gap College Prep. He studied early childhood education at Texas Southern University and holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from Dominican University. In 2022, Mr. Austin was invited to the White House by the Biden administration to sit Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity, PAVE Task Force. He has also served as liaison for Luminate Capital Partners and Lululemon Ambassador, and bound member for Extra Food, Sausalito Marin City Little League, Griot Theater Company, and at Mark Day School. He's married to former school principal and founder of Critical Friends, Tanisha Tate, and father of two. Tammy Edmonson represents the police team Mill Valley Free, MVFREE, the Mill Valley Force for Racial Equity and Empowerment. MVFREE is an advocacy organization working to advance the racial equity in Mill Valley and beyond, and is an outgrowth of the Mill Valley DEI Task Force, which provided an anti-racist blueprint for all facets of Mill Valley city life. Tammy is a retired criminal defense attorney who brings a data and policy perspective to MVFREE's battle against systematic racism and the criminal justice system. She grew up in Marin and has a long history of volunteer community and nonprofit leadership in the county in the fields of social justice, education, arts, and culture, and the environment. Cesar Lagleva is a lifelong Marin resident who grew up in San Rafael's Canal neighborhood after immigrating from the Philippines in the late 1970s. Cesar gained his personal lived experience in the justice system as a young person through his personal struggles and the struggles of his neighborhood friends and peers. As a young adult, Cesar fostered 16 youth while raising 2 of his own children. Professionally, he worked at the then Canal Community Alliance as a youth program director between 1990 and 1997, licensed clinical social worker between 1999 and 2014 at Marin County Juvenile Probation through the Department of Health and Human Services, and served as the equity manager for the county's Behavioral Health and Recovery Services Division between 2014 and 2019, before retiring in 2020. Currently, Cesar is an adjunct professor at Dominican University, has a private psychotherapy practice, and leads diversity training and workshops, offers consultant services related to DEI with a specialty on race, class, and gender. Celimene Pasteur is a biochemist and has been a resident of Mill Valley for 15 years. She proudly sits at the leadership team and police working group of the Mill Valley Force for Racial Equity and Empowerment, MVFREE, and describes her true passion as advocating for racial justice. A Haitian American, she is devoted mother of 4. We will start this evening with a statistical overview and related comments by Tammy. Tammy, would you please start us off? Tammy Edmonson.
Thank you, Noah, for that introduction, and thank you, Marin Coalition, for inviting MVFREE to be part of this forum. It is great to be in the company of community activists like Cesar Lagleva and Paul Austin, and of course, my MVFREE partner, Celimene Pasteur. I am here to talk about racial profiling in Marin from a data-based perspective. I can't speak to what it's like to be targeted by police in that way, but I do know that the refusal of local law enforcement and political leaders to even acknowledge the problem is salt in the wounds for those who do experience it. And the official denial, which we heard from Sheriff Scardina when he spoke to this group a couple of months ago, is a major obstacle to ending racial inequities in our criminal justice system. And I get it. When we talk about racial bias in law enforcement, it can feel like an attack on an officer's character and professionalism. But we need to remember that it is human nature to generalize based on our own limited experience and imperfect information. And in this racialized world, all of us harbor racial biases. We're focused on police bias, as we must be, because when bias is backed by the force of law and deadly weapons, it can have especially devastating consequences. So now I'm going to share my screen so that you can see some graphics in my presentation. I think I have the capacity to share my screen. Let me have a peek. There it is. So I'm going to start by touching briefly on the human costs of racial profiling, just so we don't lose track of the fact that the statistics and numbers I'm going to be talking about here represent real people and real pain. But I'll devote most of my time to talking about the stop data from the Marin County Sheriff's Office and what that tells us about racial disparities in Marin County policing. I will also respond to some of the sheriff's objections to the data. And then Celimene's going to take over and talk about some of the things that Marin County can and should do to combat racial profiling before it goes back to Noah and the panel for the forum discussion. So by now we all know that racial profiling in the US can be deadly for Black and brown people. But not everyone is aware of how often these kinds of horrifying incidents happen. On average, police in the US kill more than 3 people every day, and Black Americans are 3 times more likely than white Americans to be shot and killed by police. Pardon me. And Black people are more likely to be unarmed when killed than white people. And if you think that can't happen in Marin County, you should know that more than half of the police killings in the US this year happened in suburban areas, just like Marin County. And most of them began with traffic stops and other detentions completely unrelated to violent crime. Police killings are, of course, just one end of a whole spectrum of harms caused by racial profiling. 7 in 10 Black Americans say they've experienced racial profiling or mistreatment by police, and nearly half report that they feared for their lives in those encounters. So that amounts to millions of Black Americans shouldering deep and lasting physical, psychological, and emotional trauma as a result of racial profiling. So how do we identify, measure, and address racial disparities in local policing? Well, the California Racial and Identity Profiling Act, or RIPA, requires all California law enforcement agencies to collect and report demographic data on every person they detain or stop. And that's not just traffic stops. That's any person who's detained, whether on the street, in their home, or whatever. So it's really capturing the whole range of police activity. And you can see in this slide some of the kinds of information that's now available under RIPA. This statute was passed in 2015, but its requirements only became fully operative in 2021. So let's look at the RIPA data for the Marin County Sheriff's Office, or the MCSO. MVFREE analyzed the data for the year ending March 2022, which included nearly 4,500 stops. So we'll start with the most, let me get my pointer here. Start with the most basic comparisons in this left-hand column. The top chart shows the demographic makeup of the sheriff's jurisdiction, unincorporated Marin. We'll compare that to the bottom chart, which shows the racial makeup of all MCSO stops in a year. And as you can see, white people make up a much larger percentage of the population, 64%, than they do of the people stopped by the MCSO, 51%. That's because the MCSO is stopping a greatly disproportionate number of Black and brown people. You can see here that Latinx people, who comprise just 12% of the population, make up almost a quarter of all MCSO stops. And Black people, who make up just 2% of the population, comprise fully 17% of all MCSO stops. So the racial disparities in this basic comparison seem pretty definitive, but the more precise and important calculation, the one relied on by the RIPA board, is the ratio of disparity. This measures the difference in the rates of detention for different racial groups compared to the rate for white people. So here you see the dotted horizontal line represents the rate at which white people are detained by the Marin County Sheriff's Office compared to the colored bars for different racial groups, red for Black people, blue for Latinx, and green for Asian. As you can see, Asian people are being stopped by the MCSO at about half the rate of white people. By contrast, Latinx people are being stopped at more than double the rate of white people. And Black people are stopped by the Marin County Sheriff's Office, at nearly 9 times the rate of white people. So some people look at these numbers and they say, well, hey, maybe the stop rates are higher for Black and Latinx people because they're just committing more crimes. So I want to take just a second to acknowledge the racial bias inherent in that proposition, but more important to note that that is just not what the evidence shows. In over 2/3 of all MCSO detentions, regardless of race, deputies found no cause for citation or arrest. Black, white, and Latinx detainees are all released with no action taken at virtually identical rates. Now I want to share some numbers that I think are important because they can help us to understand how very different the experience of living in Marin County is for different racial groups because of racial profiling. For this slide, we compared the number of MCSO detentions in a year for each racial group with the number of residents in each racial group. Here, the dotted horizontal line represents the total population in unincorporated Marin for each racial group. We ran the numbers for 1 year and for 5 years. So let's look at the left-hand column, the 1-year numbers, because this is pretty stunning, I think. The number of Sheriff's Office detentions of Black people in just 1 year is equal to 45% of the total Black population of unincorporated Marin. The number of Latinx detentions equals 12% of the total population of Latinx people. By comparison, the number of white detentions by the MCSO equals just 5% of the white population, and Asians are doing even better. So moving to the right-hand column, you can see how these inequities are multiplied over the years. At the current rate of MCSO detentions, the number of Black people stopped in just 5 years equals 223% of the entire Black population. So what goes through your mind when you see a sheriff's car in Marin County? The answer likely depends entirely on your race. Me, I barely notice them. I grew up in unincorporated Marin and have lived here all my life, and I have never, not once, been stopped by a sheriff's deputy. And the same thing is true for my entire family. But if you are Black, odds are that you and your family members have been stopped so many times that the sight of a sheriff's car makes your heart race. And that is the reality that painfully reverberates throughout Marin's Black and brown communities. So what has the Sheriff's Office done with this information since it began collecting RIPA data in 2021? Well, the answer so far is nothing, apart from trying to downplay its significance. The sheriff has raised a variety of theoretical and technical concerns rather than talking about the racial disparities in MCSO activities and what can be done about them. So let's look at the sheriff's three main claims. Claim number one, the sheriff says most of the time, deputies can't tell what race a person is until after they've stopped the car. So it's impossible for the stops to be the result of racial profiling. Well, I want to remind you that RIPA does not just apply to traffic stops, but okay, let's look at traffic stops since that's the claim. Next time you are driving or sitting at the side of the road, test out the sheriff's claim. You can play guess the driver's race. I think you will agree that if the deputies are really unable to do this, a majority of the time, they might want to get their vision tested. I also think it's important to note that racial disparities don't just show up in the initial detention rates. They're reflected at all stages of the detention, who gets searched, when and how force is used, and so on. And those disparities, those racial disparities, are reinforced at every phase of the criminal justice system, culminating in the mass incarceration of Black and brown people, which is part of what RIPA is aiming to address. So let's look at claim number two. The sheriff says, well, some MCSO stops result from community members' calls for service. And it might be those calls that are causing the racial disparities that we see in the data. Well, race-based calls for service in Marin are a concern, but only 15% of MCSO stops result from a call for service. And when we remove those calls from the data, the racial disparities remain. So that's not the explanation. So finally, we'll look at the third claim, and this has been the sheriff's main talking point. He says you can't measure racial disparities in the MCSO stops based on a comparison to population demographics, because not everybody stopped by the MCSO as a Marin County resident. And you got to follow this. It's possible, the argument goes, that visitors to Marin are so heavily and disproportionately Black and brown that they shift the county's total racial demographics, enough to explain the greatly elevated MCSO detention rates for Black and brown people and the low detention rates for whites and Asians. Of course, the majority of people stopped by the MCSO are Marin County residents, over 60%. And local population demographics measured by the census are the only logical and available benchmark for local racial representation. That's why the RIPA board uses that benchmark, and it is probably why the sheriff has never suggested an alternative measure. But set aside all of that, there is an easy way to test whether visitors to Marin are falsely inflating the MCSO racial stop disparities in the way that the sheriff has hypothesized. Just remove the non-resident stops from the MCSO data and rerun the analysis. That's what we did, and this is what we found. This table shows in the left-hand column the MCSO racial disparities when all MCSO stops, resident and non-resident, are included in the calculation. These are the numbers I showed you earlier. But look at the center chart. This is where we've removed all non-resident stops and done the straight apples per apples comparison, resident stops and resident demographics. As you can see, contrary to the sheriff's suggestion, the inclusion of those visitor stops actually was suppressing the appearance of racial disparities in MCSO stops. In other words, the more precise analysis shows that the MCSO overall stop disparities are even worse than was reflected under the more general benchmarking test. Finally, I've added this third column just to put these disparities into perspective. This column shows the average racial disparities for all 58 California law enforcement agencies whose data is included in the 2023 RIPA report. Clearly, whether you're talking in absolute or comparative terms, Marin County has a racial profiling problem. But what's important in this data is not the exact number, whether Black people are stopped at 8.7 or 10.11 times the rate of white people. What is important is the undeniably large racial disparities in MCSO policing. The point of RIPA is not to demonstrate our statistical precision. It's to overcome and eliminate racial inequities in policing wherever they are found. Celimene's going to talk about some of the things that we can do in that regard. But now I just want to end with this plea to Sheriff Scardina and other local law enforcement leaders. Please, please stop fighting the data and start fighting the very real and very harmful problem of racial disparities in Marin County policing. MVFREE will be happy to work with you in that regard. So now I'm going to switch it over to Celimene to talk about what can be done about it.
Thank you, Tammy. So I'm going to talk about some of the strategies for combating racial profiling. There's actually a lot that Marin County can do and that other jurisdictions are doing. In the time we have, I'll touch on just a few examples. The annual RIPA reports provide many more recommendations for tackling bias and inequity across the spectrum of police activities. Effective anti-bias policing policies are a good starting place. Like many law enforcement agencies, the Marin Sheriff's Office uses standard form policies from a company called Lexipol. Lexipol policies are designed to meet minimum legal requirements for law enforcement. They do not reflect industry best practices. The experts on the RIPA board have urged agencies that use Lexipol to proactively review and revise their anti-bias policies. We recommend the sheriff start with the 3 areas identified on this slide for where the MCSO either has no policy or its policy has fallen far short of the tested best practices recommended by the RIPA board. The slide shows just some of the deficiencies in the MCSO policies in comparison to the RIPA recommendations. The MCSO bias-free policing policy says right up front that there are no procedures associated with this policy. The policy offers a vague directive not to engage in bias-based policing, but has none of the enforceable requirements, practical guidance, or accountability measures of the RIPA model policy. On bias by proxy, which is race-based calls for service, the Sheriff's Office has no applicable policy. MVFREE has worked with the Mill Valley Police Department to develop a bias by proxy policy aligned with the RIPA model. That policy provides, among other things, guidance to help officers and dispatchers identify and track race-based calls, specifically procedures to protect the subjects of race-based calls from needless police interference, and mandated follow-up with callers to educate them about the proper uses of 911. Finally, the MCSO anti-bias training policy just recites the minimum statutory requirement of 1 anti-bias course every 5 years. This is, in effect, no policy at all. Think about what we're trying to accomplish with anti-bias training. We're trying to transform the existing culture of an agency that has allowed racial disparities to become entrenched and to address the biases of individual officers who typically believe themselves to be free of bias. That is no small task. This is why the Whipper Board urges frequent anti-bias training, ideally several times a year, and recommends that anti-bias concepts and practices be consistently woven into the fabric of the agency's operations. We urge the sheriff to prioritize improving the MCSO anti-bias training policy and practices to conform to the quality, quantity, content, and methodologies provided by the Whipper Board. Deputies are asked to perform a lot of functions that are not the best fit for law enforcement officers. Service calls involving people with mental and behavioral health challenges are a prime example. The force-based tools and tactics of law enforcement can be especially threatening to these individuals and can cause a routine encounter to escalate into violence. Many jurisdictions have found that these calls can be handled more safely and more effectively and at lower cost by well-trained unarmed service providers. Marin County has a mobile crisis team staffed by mental health providers who should be the first responders dispatched to all mental and behavioral health calls. Unfortunately, MVFREE has heard from local police and school representatives that mobile crisis team has insufficient staff and resources to meet the needs of our community. When officers or school staff call on this team, they say it can take hours for them to arrive if they come at all. MVFREE would welcome the chance to work with the sheriff and other local law enforcement leaders to document the need for a better resource crisis team and to appeal to the Board of Supervisors to prioritize that support. We also recommend that MCSO revise its Lexapol policy on crisis intervention. The vague suggestions and considerations in that policy should be replaced with clear procedure directives. De-escalation should be mandatory in all but the most extreme circumstances. And the policy should clearly designate the crisis response team as the lead first responders in all mental and behavioral health calls. So now let's talk about pretext stops. The Fourth Amendment is supposed to protect all of us from unreasonable search and seizure. This means that police are not allowed to detain you at random without a reasonable suspicion that you are committing a specific crime. But police have found a way around this called pretext stop. That is where officers use an insignificant infraction or equipment violation, like a broken taillight, to justify the stop. Then poke around using the stop in the hope that they might stumble upon evidence of a crime. The Whipper Board has found that across the state, pretext stops are used disproportionately to target people of color. That is why the 2023 Whipper Board recommends that the practice of pretext stops be banned. Many jurisdictions have followed this recommendation, including San Francisco, Berkeley, and Los Angeles. Right now, a bill, SB 50, is working its way through the legislature that would ban pretext stops throughout California. Now let's look at the MCSO data relating to pretext stops. To simplify this analysis, MVFREE limited our definition of a pretext stop to vehicle lighting infractions and expired registration stops. To keep in mind, but keep in mind that there are a lot of additional MCSO stops that qualify as pretext stops under the usual broader definition. The left-hand column on the side shows who is impacted most by the MCSO pretext stops. Here you see the familiar pattern. Black people are singled out for pretext stops at the highest rate, followed by Latinx people. The center chart on this slide shows that pretext stops make up a huge proportion, more than a third, of all MCSO activity. If the sheriff wants to reduce the unnecessary and traumatizing stops of people of color in Marin, eliminating pretext stops is a good place to start. So why keep making pretext stops? We have heard two explanations. First, some people say that enforcing minor equipment and administrative regulations raises government revenue and could have safety implications. If the MCSO has truly prioritized enforcement of this low-level infractions, deputies can achieve this objective by getting a license plate number and mailing a citation. There is no need for heavy armed deputies to confront, intimidate, and endanger community members over these administrative matters. The second argument we've heard in favor of pretext stop is that sometimes the officers happen upon serious criminal behavior during a pretext stop. But how often does that happen? So if you look at the third chart on this slide, you will see that 97% of the time, MCSO pretext stops do not uncover criminal behavior. Even if they did not offend our Fourth Amendment rights, random stops are clearly not a fruitful substitute for actual focused police investigation. Now, I want to finish by mentioning two issues that are on the front burner in Marin County right now: military equipment and sheriff oversight. The sheriff has a large arsenal of semi-automatic and fully automatic machine guns, explosive devices, tear gas, flashbang grenades, drones, and other military equipment. A recent state law requires local law enforcement agencies to get rid of their military equipment unless they can show there is no reasonable alternative to achieve officer and civilian safety. When deputies show up at a traffic stop armed with an AR-15, we know it greatly amplifies the risk of harm to our community, which, as we have seen, falls disproportionately on communities of color. Tomorrow, the Board of Supervisors will consider the sheriff's request to exempt all MCSO military equipment from the California ban. There is no need for this sort of weaponry in peaceful Marin County, which has the fourth lowest violent crime rate in the state. The sheriff has offered no evidence to the contrary. Please join MVFREE in urging the Board of Supervisors to enforce the ban on battlefield weapons. Finally, most of you are probably aware of that the county is in the process of developing a system of sheriff's oversight that will include an inspector general and a civilian oversight commission. This is an important opportunity for the sheriff to build community trust and legitimacy by supporting meaningful, independent civilian oversight. Details of the system will be worked out over the next 9 months or so. We expect to see the draft of an ordinance in the next coming weeks. I hope everyone will stay informed and get involved. Thank you.
Okay, Noah, you want to take us to our next presenter? Noah, are you there? There he is.
I am here, and
Oh, actually, we're now on the panel, right?
I think we're on the full panel now. So we'll have a roundtable discussion with all, and starting with questions to Cesar and Paul to their paths to involvement in policing issues.
All right, so we want to spotlight
Cesar, yes.
Paul.
What was
There
the
we
question?
go. Alan, I don't know if maybe. There we are. Okay, Noah, take it away.
Okay, Cesar, we're again in a moderate discussion with all five now. Questions to both you and Paul relative to paths to involvement in policing issues.
Who would you like to go first, Noah?
You can start, Cesar.
So first of all, I'd like to thank Tammy and Celimene for the wonderful presentation and the data presentation that really tells the story. And so I suppose that Paul and I's contribution to this work or this presentation this evening is to really put a human face, an emotion, and perhaps the experience behind that. So in thinking about the data set, which is the story, I want to offer first the context that in Marin, as a man of color, the reality of day-to-day experience and living is different from my white counterparts. Let's just establish that from the get-go. I think that we live in a society in which we often try to find similarities that bond and unite us together. But unfortunately, we live in a society, community, a county that has been developed to systematically divide us. So I want to approach this conversation in 2, 3, perhaps 4 levels around the dynamic relationships of people of color, such as myself, as it relates to law enforcement. Also offer a dynamic experience about the reality of our experiences as people of color. And I'm speaking obviously in general terms, but as a member of the BIPOC community, I think I can attest to many of the data points and the realities that presents. And then the third and fourth, and perhaps equally or more importantly, is the emotional response and reaction to the dynamic relationships between BIPOC and law enforcement systems. And I also want to underscore that this is not an indictment on any particular individuals in law enforcement or departments, but it is a complete examination of the role, the intention, and the impact of law enforcement systems, and equally more importantly, its cultures. It is there that I tend to look at the underpinning of why we have such a chasm and such a division between law enforcement and BIPOC communities that my white counterparts and loved ones do not seem to often experience. So race does play a huge role in policing, law enforcement, as it relates to systems and its culture and its practices. As a young person, growing up in the Canal neighborhood, I can sit here and tell you all of the gory details of what I've had to go through as a young person, as an immigrant, in which I was first inoculated and introduced to the whole notion that law enforcement is our ally, our friend, someone who is supposed to protect and to serve us in a time of need. But coming to this country and literally moving right from a relatively privileged position in my native land, the Philippines, and then now experiencing, not having to have experienced relative poverty, being raised in the Canal. Those concepts and those trainings and conditioning of information completely got turned upside down and backwards to the degree that the experience, while the message was supposedly at the time positive, the reality was quite different. It was by and large negative. That I grew up in a community where we're supposed to be suspicious of law enforcement. I grew up in a community, in a neighborhood where the very same institution and systems who are supposed to protect and to serve are there to harass, to discriminate, and to abuse. And this is not something that I was able to reconcile as a young person, because the messages were so vastly different from the larger society and our idealism and the vision of what law enforcement is supposed to represent. But not realizing until I was in my early teens that those concepts of ideal values and principles that we have high regard for law enforcement did not pertain to people like me. And that was very, very clear from the get-go in my first interaction with law enforcement all the way through my adulthood. So I can get into the specifics of that, but I want to stop and pause for a moment because I just want to sort of at this time set the context and the foundation of this conversation, and then giving it to my brother Paul.
Yeah, Paul, do you want to talk about your path to involvement in policing issues?
Absolutely, absolutely. So once again, thank you for having me. The data do speak, loud and clear. But also, I grew up here in Marin City, which is a historically Black community. We were a red line to Marin City after World War II. And so that's essentially where my story started. My grandparents, they migrated from the South. They stayed here, had my mom and her siblings. But growing up here in Marin County, especially as a young Black boy, you are given the lessons on how to interact with police early on. I don't think anybody realized the trauma that you don't even realize that you're going through as a young Black boy around those conversations. Having an understanding that you're not the same as your counterparts, that you will more than likely be stopped, be searched, and had a law broken against you. I lived it. I lived it early on in my life. I seen it firsthand. When we say the pretext stops, right? I love that word. Unwarranted stops. The sheriff department will always say that Marin City is not used as a training ground, but it's usually one of the first places that the new deputies land once they become a sheriff. So it's like, how is it not a training ground when you have brand new officers itching to use some of the tactics that they learned as they became a cop? So, I consider myself a community connector, and we can fast forward to the murder of George Floyd, which pushed everybody into doing one or two things. You either was going to listen and pay attention, or you was going to stand up and do what was right. And what that led me to was helping young people, especially, have a voice, to be able to get out there and protest police violence, police discrimination at a large level. I led several protests alongside quite a few of my friends and young people throughout Marin County. We did Marin City, Novato, Mill Valley, Tipperon twice. And the second time in Tipperon, it was over officers coming and just directly harassing Yema at his shop, him and his wife, which everybody saw went viral. One thing I can say is that the power of the people stood up in that moment and was able to get the captain to step down, the Tipperon captain to step down, as well as the officer. So one thing that we can do is we could show up in numbers, because it wasn't just Black and Latinx folks that was out there protesting. It was a lot of our white counterparts writing letters, making phone calls, and utilizing their power of privilege like none other. Now, as we see in this President's Day, that things have settled down, people fell back into their normal routines. But why Black and Latinx folks are still being killed, still being stopped. So this is a wonderful opportunity, and I'm always looking to call people to the table to be in this fight on Black and brown folks, especially in this county, because your voice, for whatever reason, has historically always spoke louder than the oppressed people. So policing, this is something that I'm always going to have my eyes on, as well as so many other issues. But this is an opportunity for us to make change. I have a young son that's 14. And of course, we've had that discussion and continue to have the discussion with him about how to interact with police when that time comes, because trust me, it's going to come. And so, yes, even to this day, I still get nervous. I've been stopped for not having my license plate on the front of my car. But it's interesting, right? Because the sheriff department, at least a lot of the sheriffs, know who I am. And so our conversation goes a little bit differently. But nevertheless, my heart does not stop beating rapidly.
Have you concluded? Oh, you've concluded. Thank you so much, Paul. We'll turn it back over to Scott Penske, who will take questions unmuted from selected audience members. Scott?
Thank you, Noah, and thank you, members of the panel, for what I have to say. It was a riveting presentation. I'm going to stay off camera here so that we can focus on our presenters and Noah. We have a couple of questions that have come in already, and for those of you who would like to bring a question to our panel, you can either type it into the chat window, or you can raise your hand and we'll try and watch for those. I have one right now. It looks like Lynn Feinerman. Lynn, I'm going to unmute you and ask you to go ahead and present your question. I think you might need to click unmute.
Yeah, I did. Thank you.
There you are.
Thanks very much for this really good and heartfelt presentation. I would just like to say, and I hope it doesn't take too long, that's why I didn't put it in the chat, that I was involved in the cycle. I was one of those white folks out there for the demos on the Yema incident, and also keeping really close track of what was happening vis-a-vis the meeting that we had, the long meeting, and also writing in the ARC and the Tiburon ARC and so forth. And one thing that really concerned me about that whole incident, and that concerns me about the data that was presented so clearly and carefully by MVFREE, is that, you know, we had a police chief quit, one of the officers who had to leave, and it had turned out that he had problems. We had a police officer who had to quit because he was found to be in violation of behavior towards a minor. And we had a police officer commit suicide in the police station. What I'm concerned about is that, and you know, there are rising stats of not only police forces being, shall we use the word invaded, but, you know, joined by right-wing elements, people who have deeply right-wing viewpoints, and meaning, you know, for me, I mean, left, right, it's difficult, but meaning for me that they hold very strong opinions, and some of them are quite racist. and anti-Semitic and etc. And we also have the clear demonstration in Tiburon that there is a lot of mental anguish or mental problems going on with the police. And I find it interesting that, you know, one of the things that MV3 is pushing for is, you know, officers to handle the mental health of the people who are being stopped. I think we need a cap to talk about police mental health. I think there is a radical problem with police taking jobs because they are really needing positions in which they can order other people around, in which they can bully people. And I don't need to, you know, take a prejudice only in that, you know, in that vein. I'm sure that, you know, there is, I like and I'm sure that everything that MV3 is pushing for, and especially, you know, to get those AR-15s and military weaponry off the street, I'm totally with that. And please tell me how we can support you tomorrow. But I'm concerned about the dismissal of deep mental problems and deep socio-political problems in the actual police force itself. Thank you.
See,
like that's
Margaret.
for
I'm
anyone.
sorry, Scott. Go ahead.
No, sorry, go ahead, Noah. I was just going to say, it sounds like that would be a question for anyone on the panel. But go ahead, Noah.
Oh, why don't we get a response from somebody on the panel before we go to Margaret Moriarty?
Right.
Sure. Oh, please.
Yeah, so I think, Margaret, I'm not sure you heard me correctly. I think what I was saying was not for police officers to interact with people with mental health illness. We're saying they're not the right person to come with a badge and a gun and deal with someone who's having a mental health crisis. We want someone who's not armed to deal with that. So that's what we were saying. So you said quite the opposite of what I mentioned in the talk. I don't know.
Thanks for your response. Let's go to Margaret and then to Lisa Bennett.
All right, Margaret, I'm going to click a button and hopefully you can unmute. There you go.
Thanks, Scott.
Hi, my name's Marguerite Moriarty. I'm from San Rafael, and my comment is going to be directed not just to the policing, but to just the general pervasive, except for the people that are here, racism in Marin County. I'm one of those people that came to this after George Floyd. And I've been very active in Golden Gate Village and stopping 825 Drake Avenue. You know, I really strongly believe that the white folks, privileged white people in the county, all of us that are here tonight, we need to be speaking to our neighbors and our friends about all of these issues. It's just plain wrong, you know, and it's not going to change until we get out. And I really feel like people need to start having, you know, little house meetings with their neighbors and talking about these things. I sat out at the Good Earth having lunch with my San Anselmo friend. As we sat there on the patio, I watched, I don't know if it was the sheriff or if it was the Ross Valley police, you know, pull over an African-American, 3 Black people in the car. And literally my friend and I just sat there and just trembled while we watched this whole incident. And, you know, I mean, that's not the first time. I've seen that, and anyway, I'm just speaking to all of you because you know, it's a problem in our county, and it's not going to change until we all rise up, you know, and we don't have to do it in an ugly way. But, you know, Martin Luther King said we need to be direct and disruptive. But as you all know, he was nonviolent. But, you know, that's what I have to say. Thanks.
Well, Marguerite, before I ask for reactions from the panel, if anyone has any thoughts on it, let me just say that your observation dovetails right in with why we're doing what we're doing today. I mean, the reason that we are doing this panel at Marin Coalition is to get this issue discussed and get more people in the discussion with us, to hear some of this information, to hear the statistical data that has been put forward by Tammy and Celimene and others, and educate ourselves more deeply into this and spread the word, at least to those who were able to make it today. And I should also remind everyone, we record these programs. All our programs are recorded, and they are available on our website at no cost. It usually takes a day or so after the event to come up live on the, or not live, but to come up on the website. But as of tomorrow afternoon, you can go on our website, you can find this recording, and you can email the link at no cost to anybody you want. And if they're willing to spend an hour and a half and watch this, or even, you know, 40 minutes and watch the first part of it and get the data download, they'll share in the information that we have been able to pass along today through our wonderful panel. So I hear what you're saying. I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to hear these panelists discuss this with the authority that they have. And before we go to our next question from Lisa, if anybody on the panel has something else they'd like to share, please feel free. Otherwise, we can keep going on the questions, but feel free to chime in.
Well, in line of what I think people have said already, that it's very important on a very pragmatic or practical level just to stay engaged. If the goal here and the objective here is accountability, there are so many avenues and paths, locally, jurisdictionally, regionally, for folks to get involved. And I'm operating from the lens of a grassroots perspective, that any members of our community, if interested and have the will and the ability to just simply get involved, it doesn't really take a whole lot. Advocacy through writing, letters, showing up where public events are gathered, lobbying elected officials, because if we're going to get into a place of accountability, it really starts with us really pushing forward as a collective. So I want to just offer that this issue, while it's been going on for centuries, and while it could be very daunting, it actually has many different paths to actually get people involved on a very individual, small level, but cumulative impact. If members of our community can simply see that they have a part in this, a role in this, and an effect in transforming the system, meaning the law enforcement system and its culture.
Thanks, Cesar. I think the next three, either questioners or commenters, are Lisa Bennett, Stephen Bingham, and Frank Leitman. Lisa?
Hi. This is a great informational event. Thank you for doing this. One thing I want to share is, you know, the events that happened with Yema, with George Floyd, with the man we now refer to as Mateo, all happened outrage grew because people saw it as it was filmed, right? So what I'd like to do is suggest that those of you who are interested could learn how to become observers of police activity. And I say this because this is something I used to train people to do as part of my immigrant justice work, how to be there when ICE shows up and what rights you have, what you can and cannot do. And I think there's a way to take that training and share it with the general public. And the more we show up to film police activity, the more people are going to be aware of it. And you know, it's not going to be just a story. It's going to be there on video. People can see it. And that really does fuel the flames of outrage. I did this myself. I used my rapid response training to film sheriff's deputies pulling over a Black family in Marin City. And I did what they said. I followed all the rules and I caught it on film. And I don't know what I prevented, but imagine if there were hundreds of us out there doing this. Then we'd start to see some change. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. We're going to go on to Frank Liebman in a second. Let me just read something from Tammy before we hear from Frank. Anyone interested in signing up for newsletters from the MVFREE organization can go to mvfree.org, mvfree.org. There you can sign up for invitations to meetings, receive alerts, and other information. Okay, Frank, I'm going to try to invite you to unmute, unless Alan, you've already done that. I don't know.
He's still muted.
Okay.
And then Stephen Bingham, I believe, is next.
Here we go.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I went out of order. Frank, can we let Stephen go first, and then
Of course.
Sorry about that. Go ahead, Stephen.
You're muted, Stephen.
So I'm clicking to unmute you, Alan. It's not working for some reason. Why don't we
I'm here. I'm sorry, that was me.
There you go. Okay.
Anyway, great presentations, everyone, particularly the RIPA data presentation, which I know something about RIPA, but learned a whole bunch of things. I wanted to just briefly reinforce something that Cesar mentioned about police culture. And an interesting little fact that a lot of people don't pay attention to. We've all probably seen the video body camera of Julio Lopez, who we thought of as Mateo for a long time. And we focus on the two officers getting involved. There were other officers there, and they didn't do anything. And that, in some ways, even more, because if you focus on the two, you can say, oh, bad apples. We hear that all the time. If you focus on the two that didn't do anything, it's like that's the proof of a culture problem. And we need to reinforce that in any interactions we have with staff at the police departments that we're trying to change. We've been meeting, a bunch of us, with Chief Spiller in San Rafael, trying to develop something a little similar to the Oversight Commission. And, you know, he's a nice guy. Some of you may know him, but he just doesn't get it in terms of him having a police culture that really needs to be built, changed from bottom up. So I just wanted, because I appreciated Cesar mentioning that and what he said, and I just wanted to reinforce it. Thanks.
Okay, Frank, why don't you go ahead? I think you're unmuted now.
Yeah, I'll take Stephen's point and say that it happens one officer at a time. I am a member of the police group of MVFREE, along with Tammy and Celimene and others. One of the things we are doing is having established a relationship with Mill Valley Police Chief Rick Navarro. I volunteered to do a ride-along with Mill Valley Police Department officers on duty. I did that ride-along, and I now have a relationship with a Mill Valley Police Department officer who realized that I'm not threatening his job or reputation. why doesn't the sheriff open up his office, his Marin County Sheriff's Office, to that kind of partnering with citizens? And note, I'm not using the word oversight. It's important that MCSO realize that they are not immune from partnering with those of us who care enough to want the change. I think we need to, and unfortunately, until now, have been deprived of the ability to have those relationships and change one officer at a time. That's it.
Anything from the panel in response?
Yeah, I'll dive in really quickly. No, that's absolutely right. I feel like even though you have opportunity to build relationships, it is the system that needs to be held accountable, right? Because it's within the system that you have all these pretext stops that's allowed Black people to be stopped at 9 times the rate of white people, because it's going to continue unless there's some sort of penalty that individuals will have to face within that system. And so that's one of the things that we need to make sure that it's clear that it's just not okay. It's unfortunate that it's continuously probably not being said that it's okay, but these are some of the trainings that they go through. And so, because I like quite a few of our sheriffs on an individual basis, but the system is what allows folks to continuously be stopped. It's the system that allowed military tanks to be brought to Marin City in suspicious suspects, right, to arrest some suspects a few years back. 3 of them, 3 tanks, that came in like it was the Army early in the morning while children were trying to walk to school, in which I witnessed, right? It's also the system that allows Shaka Grayson to get shot multiple times over a traffic stop here in Marin City in 2014, right? And so until people especially police departments, start holding their own officers to a higher standard and letting them know, like, hey, you will be eliminated out of the system, not just transferred to another district or another county, but to actually lose their job and can also possibly be facing prison time. Like, something drastic needs to happen as far as the law is involved.
Okay, on to Laura. Laura, I've clicked the unmute and let's add you into the conversation.
Thank you. I'm Laura McDonald. I'm the founder of Next Steps Liaison Project, and I run programs inside the Marin and San Francisco juvenile halls. And I have a question. I wanted to thank the whole panel. Thank you all so much. Particularly, I kind of go on my gut, and so I really appreciate the data. So Tammy, thank you for all that data, because we know that together it's the data and the stories together that really drive things home. So we need that data. So I have 2 questions. One is, do you have any data that pertains specifically to juveniles in Marin County, and how juveniles are experiencing police contact in Marin County? That's one question. And then my other question is, again, when it comes to stories, it's important that these stories do go viral, like the gentleman in Canal and the couple in Tiburon. But I was wondering, on the other side of it, do you all remember the story that of all this kind of white mob of teenagers that had things shut down by the CVS in Mill Valley? I think it was like a year ago. And I believe some kids were throwing stuff at the police, rocking police cars, looting, and the CVS had to close. Can you imagine if that was a Black group? And I remember thinking, boy, I'm going to see some of these youngsters in my classes tomorrow. And I didn't see any. And I started asking people, was the whole mob white? And I didn't see one of these youth. It's going to take some time to process. They'll be here. And I didn't see them. And look, I'm the last one who wants to lock up a child, but I was alarmed that stores had to close and police officers were actually assaulted, and not one white child was brought into the juvenile hall, and that's a story. That's a big story. In fact, I was trying to reach out to Cesar, and we just ended up playing phone tag a bit. I was sort of I was like, is anybody else noticing? Like, did anybody else notice this? So I was just wondering about the panel. If you remember that story, or and also the data on youth and how youth are policed in our county.
I could speak to the data.
Thank you.
There's the RIPA data does include juvenile data. It's, there's not as much of it, and so we haven't done a deep dive in analyzing that. And it can be hard to. You should see these spreadsheets of data. It's not particularly friendly to doing the juvenile stuff. I will say that MVFREE has tried to do some work around SROs, and we were trying to get a pilot program going at Tam High to basically put together a memorandum of understanding. Most of these schools that allow police officers into their campuses, and I know this is true of the Mill Valley schools from elementary to high school, they have no agreement between the school and the police department about what the officers can and cannot do on the campuses. And that is, talk about your best practices. There should be a memorandum of understanding. There should be strong protections for the constitutional rights. There should be rights for parents to be present before a child is questioned. There's, so we've been trying really hard to get something like that. Unfortunately, we were this close when the Tam High principal left. And so we're kind of back at ground zero and starting over with that. But you've piqued my curiosity, and I am going to take another look at the RIPA data and see what I can pull together on just the youth group.
So, and Laura, just to dovetail off of Tammy, I'll speak a little bit just as a former therapist or stationed at juvenile probation for many years. To juvenile probation's credit and to the probation director's credit, they've actually done quite a bit of decent work with regards to just tracking their data, because they were part, when I was there, they undertook a massive initiative. It's called the Reducing Ethnic Disparities Project, in which it resulted in them systematizing many things in the practices and the procedures about the people, the young folks who are coming into juvenile probation and juvenile hall. They are quite, at least from my recollection, they were quite transparent about their data gathering, and they shared that heavily with the Juvenile Justice Commission also. But I do know that what's been persistent at juvenile probation as well as juvenile hall, as evidenced by the population there, it is overly represented by Latinx students and young people. Okay, that's been going on for many years, and in as much as they have made efforts and attempts to really provide interventions, different types of interventions, that number of overrepresentation of Latinx students remain persistently high, and they come primarily from two different jurisdictions, Santa Fe and Novato. So one would have to really consider and ask the question, how are these Latinx students being policed in Santa Fe and in Novato? And so that becomes sort of, to me, a good hypothesis question, or an area to really consider looking at. And quite frankly, school districts also, because there is that kind of direct line between the school push-out rates, and I'm not calling them dropout rates, I'm calling them push-out rates, around expulsions.
Yeah, about also what I found interesting with your question, your statement was what took place in Mill Valley. at the CVS, and how, you know, nobody was really held accountable. It was conversation that was had here in Marin City, especially with the teenagers, right? That was like, oh, if that was us, you know, like they went straight there. Like if that was us, I know somebody had been in handcuffs. Somebody probably would have got shot. Like these are conversations that teenagers were having here in Marin City about what took place with their counterparts that they went to school with.
Right.
How
I was having that conversation with myself.
Right. And how even when the kids came back to school, it was still a topic of conversation. But you know, the Black kids are like, we can never get away with that. Right. We don't live in that road of privilege where you're able to behave like that and there's no consequences.
Well, the consequence was they were remanded to their parents. And I thought, well, that seems like an appropriate response for a child. Right. But
okay, let me jump in. We're close to the end. I have one question that came in through the chat from Ruth Ann. Sorry, we're just getting to this, but she had asked about how many folks live in the unincorporated area of Marin. This relates back to the stats for the various incorporated towns versus unincorporated. I don't know the answer to that, but maybe somebody on the panel knows.
Maybe Tammy.
I actually responded by private chat, but I will tell it for everybody else's benefit. There's 69,380 residents of unincorporated Marin. Data we only got by subtracting all of the cities from the total county population, but and there are 198 sworn officers in the sheriff's office.
I hope they have enough tanks out there. That's all I can say. All right, I'm sorry, bad joke. I think we're at the end, and I just want to say a few thank yous and wish everybody good evening. Obviously, thank you to our panelists who have given us a tremendous amount to think about here. Noah, our moderator, obviously, and also Tammy, Celimene, Cesar, and Paul. I want to thank our webmaster, Alan Shavitz, for another fantastic presentation from the back of the hall. For you and our audience, thank you for joining us. If this was your first visit to a Marin Coalition event, I hope we met your expectations and provided content that you felt was worth your time. As I said, this has been recorded, so you can pick up the link to the recording and forward that to anybody that you think might be interested in the event and seeing the recording, and we hope you will. I mean, I watched some of these myself a couple of times just because I don't catch it all in live time. So that's one of the reasons we recorded as well. Again, October 4 at noon at McGinnis Golf Center will be our next program on homeowners insurance in California. That should be a good program as well. It'd be nice to get back in person. Look forward to seeing many of you there. That wraps it up. And again, thank you for an excellent presentation to our panelists. I think this was time well spent for all of us. And I thank you for attending and look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.